Bene, allora io chiamerei al tavolo la professoressa Rosemarie Mwaipopo. Come vi ho già detto, è docente di Antropologia sociale presso l'Università di Dar es Salam, Tanzania, ed è ricercatrice e studiosa delle disuguaglianze di genere in Tanzania. Il titolo del suo intervento è Diritti delle donne e uguaglianza di genere in Tanzania.
Buongiorno. May I start by first of all thanking Marian Lambert and CVM for inviting me to share my experience from Tanzania. And it's very nice to have this audience to speak and share what I have experienced in my home country, and hoping that it will probably bring certain messages on the whole issue on women's rights and gender equality in Tanzania. And as Katia said, I work with the University of Dar es Salam. I've been a teacher for 25 years at the University of Dar es Salam, and my area of specialization is gender and women's rights, but I also teach about natural resource management. So if I may start. Yeah, just for an introduction, I just wanted to say that Tanzania, as all other African countries, the pursuit for women's rights and gender equality is an historical project. And it is intertwined with so many experiences, particularly with cultures, but also with the dominant politics of the times. But there's been a lot of space for activism, women's activism or cultural activism, and it has been accommodated when it questions power. And it has been quite beneficial in influencing how women can address some of their rights. But as any other country, as you have known, there's also been moments of silencing, particularly when questioning power is seen to be very controversial. But I want to say that Tanzania, as other African countries have experienced, we've made a lot of achievements in terms of fighting for gender rights, but there is so much more that needs to be done. And I think that's similar to other countries as well. Sorry, this thing. If I could, yeah. Now, briefly, the context for addressing gender issues in Tanzania. You can tell they're actually embedded in so many factors. One is about traditions and customary context, but the other is about historical experiences, including colonialism. And we've had our share of having harboring neighbors, refugees from all over the south of Africa. But also, we've been trying to maintain our position in the international citizenship. And then the politics of the time have made a very big difference in what we talk about gender. And then education has made a lot of difference. So when we talk about gender and women's rights, these are the contexts within which we actually address those things. Now, this is briefly the United Republic of Tanzania. It's one of the 5 countries in the East African community. It's the largest country. It has a population of about 55 point something million, where women are 51%, but we have a very huge youth population. And our major language is Kiswahili. I speak English because English is the major language in higher education and for international collaboration. Our major religions are Christianity, Islam, but we have a huge presence of traditional religions. And life expectancy is increasingly being higher, particularly for women. And we are quite a resource-rich country. It's unfortunate that we are among the poor communities in the world, but in terms of natural resources, I think we are the 4th gold producers in Africa with diamonds. Tanzanite is the only jewel that is produced in the world. And then economic growth is now 7%, but the population below poverty is about 20%. So we are rich, but we have a lot of issues to do. And this impact also on the way we address gender. And as you can see, in terms of the Gender Development Index, Tanzania is among the third, is within the third group. It actually features even better than other neighbors, particularly because of life expectancy for the women, access to services also. Now let me talk about cultures. Cultural influences on gender and gender equality is huge. Although it is declining, but it's relatively huge. Traditional practices impact a lot on what women and sometimes men can do. And in a community where we have about 112 different ethnic groups, you can see how we have different traditional practices impacting on gender, particularly when it comes to age. This is a picture from one of the communities that I work with. It's called the Barbaigu, and they have maintained their traditional practices up to this moment. And religion has a huge influence on gender. We talk about Islam and the way they define marriage, the age of marriage for the girl. We talk about Christianity and the way in which they impinge on a woman when it comes to divorce. There's so many things that people can do which are influenced by religion. But at the same time, there are so many egalitarian communities where even access to land is equal. Women can also access land, can own property, but it's not the same. Predominantly, the communities in Tanzania are patriarchal, and where men dictate most of the things, even at the households. So the impact is about inequality in decision-making, inequality in access to resources. Early marriages are common, unfortunately. But also there's some tendency of investing in male education more than the girls. Although we have some parity, but you'd find when it comes to higher education, for example, whom would you want to educate? It would be the man. Sometimes even we have cultures that practice woman-to-woman marriage, not in terms of the marriage itself, but because of the needing for a male heir to own or to carry the family name. We have female circumcision in certain communities, unfortunately. It works, but it's tradition. So here I'm trying to talk about what should women do. Women in certain cultures, different cultures, have the right to an identity, but what is harmful and what is not, and who defines what is harmful. But also religious virtues. Should I be a Christian and maintain my marriage? Or should I be an Islam and also consent to early marriages? So we are living in a heterogeneous community where we tend not to tolerate per se, but to think of what should be the right thing to do, particularly when it comes to accessing gender rights. The other thing that is also important that I wanted to share is about the legacy of colonial project and the missionaries. We've had our experience of colonialism. We got our independence in 1961, but it had a lot of baggage. And one, because of the audience here, I wanted to talk about education. Education for employment, for example. Colonial people had located themselves in certain areas which were favorable for weather particularly, and that's where education actually advanced. So you can actually even tell in the southwest, in the north, where missionary schools were there, the people were educated. But also the high schools for boys, it had been a favor of colonialism, and you find that trend continuing. So when you talk about higher education having more boys than girls, it's a legacy. But at the same time, there were also some training for girls. Girls were allocated certain professions which were seen as good, social work, the community development, social welfare, that has left that baggage. And then the missionaries were also influencing the trends in education, the way in which we grew our education processes and education systems. And one thing that is very important is that at one point, because the missionaries were more Christians, it had not excluded Islams, but the Muslims themselves didn't want to go to Christian schools. So that was a very big difference for some time. Although clever Muslim families took their boys to school and would find even regional commissioners, but they're only men. At the same time, we experienced the first kind of egalitarianism by mission-led schools. And the first 3 women who went to university in the early 1950s were actually facilitated by the Moravian Church. They went to Makerere University. So you can see that kind of difference and what they were trying to establish within that ownership. And finally, it's about property ownership. Property ownership is one of the biggest problems that we're having in Tanzania today. But it had some cultural tendencies, as I said earlier, but also colonialism. When cash crop production was at its full, sisal, cotton, tea, the registration of land ownership was done under the traditional head of the house, was the male. And that actually legalized the system of property ownership. And that was carried forward even after independence. And unfortunately, some of the things, that baggage is continuing today. Then we are part and parcel of the international community. We are not an isolate. And we want to be seen as present within the community as we talk about gender. And the country has ratified almost every gender instrument that you can talk of. CEDAW, the African Union Gender Decrees, the SADC, the Southern African Development Cooperation Gender Policy that was drawn in 1997, and it actually declared that women should be given equal opportunities to education. And we've been customizing and informing gender sensitivity and mainstreaming processes. One of the best things that has been taken up is gender mainstreaming in teaching in higher education. And gender mainstreaming in teaching in higher education began in the mid-1990s. So we've actually been accommodating what is being taken in the world and what should be applied in Tanzania. Now, let me talk about the politics of the times. The politics of the times have also had many influences. This is the picture of our first president, Mwalimu Nyerere. And what Mwalimu Nyerere did with regards to women and gender, first of all, during his right after independence, he talked about what Tanzania needs to develop is to do away with ignorance, poverty, and disease. But at the same time, even before independence, when Mwalimu Nyerere was a student at Makerere University, he actually explained how he thought the traditions in Tanzania are very unfair to the woman. And he explained his experience that, of his own mother, that when his mother used to go to farm, she would go with 2 of her children, and she would be made to farm, and his father would even touch the children. But then he had a clever brother whom would always protect his mother when the father wanted something while the mother was working. So what the brother would do, he would pinch Mwalimu Nyerere and he would cry. So when the woman would say, "What you are doing?" then the boy would say, "No, don't worry, I'll take care of the boy." But the moral of his story was that sometimes it's very important to understand what do women do with these cultures and how can we protect them. And he, at that time, came with this saying that women in Tanzania think they are chicken. They just crawl on the ground and forget that they are eagles. And he said they should spread their wings. And he also said that women in Tanzania should be taken to those big schools where we take men. Because without taking women to schools, then we are not going to make a difference. The education system or the development system won't be that inclusive. And the moral there was saying that let's capacitate women themselves, bring their capacities to a point where they can actually make a difference for their own lives. Another experience that we have also is women's participation in the political process. In this fifth phase, we now have a fifth phase of government, and for the first time, we have a female vice president. She's called Samia Suluhu. And we have certain representation of females in the cabinet, not so much, as you can see, but for a long time, we've had a special provision on having special seats in parliament for women. Since 2010, that provision is 30% representation in parliament. So these special seats are also in the local councils where in every local council, you should have 30% of the representatives to be women. But their only clause should be they should know how to read and write. So you can see how the process was actually trying to say, how do we get women who can make a difference to women's lives, but give them a platform to speak for other women? So this was in the Constitution. But another thing, as you can say, politics is something else, and politics can be beneficial, but it can also be legitimizing systems for gender inequality. For example, having women in the political process to fight for gender rights was seen as a very, very advanced step. But the experience is that sometimes women can be used to facilitate something. Women at home are very active members for mobilization. They can mobilize for a particular leader, and eventually the leader, probably a man, and not even their own women, because we've never had 50-50 representation. So they are used by the system to legitimize the system, and gender inequality remains as it is. And on the other thing, when you analyze the presence of the vice president, is that it's also strategic. I'm trying to say this so as we think of why do we have female representatives, are they there for the women or they are simply there for the political system? In 2015, we had our strongest opposition process in the general elections, things that we learned from other countries in Europe. But at that time, we had a very strong opposition. And that opposition was said to win that election. But the ruling party played its game. And by electing a running mate to be a female, it was actually appealing to female voters. And who goes to vote? In my country, it's women. They go to vote any time. So by doing that, actually, it's won. It was quite an easy way to do that thing. But the other thing is also women themselves. Some of the special seats representatives are questioning themselves that yes, we get the special seats. It's like you are selected and favored into a position, but it doesn't give you the clout, let's say, to make a final decision on women's issues in a particular area, because you don't have the mandate of a geographical location. I think you know special seats. Special seats can be, they are chosen from the representation in political parties. They are not necessarily chosen from a particular geographical entity like Senegalia. So you'd represent, let's say, Fermo in general. So you don't have the ultimate clout to say this should be done in what area. So they're also questioning themselves whether they should be there or shouldn't be there. And that's why we are having our general elections next year. Many of them are looking for geographical seats, for parliamentary seats. And then at this other time is that there's a lot of questioning about the historical disadvantages that had actually led to this special seats clause. People are trying to say, is it favoritism? Are we still maintaining the historical disadvantage that is applying today? So there's so many questions. And that's why when we talk about working for female rights using the special seats, is it really valid? Are the women themselves accepting it? So those are some of the questions that are going on. But in terms of national policy processes, Tanzania has made advances. Every government policy it is mandatory to mainstream gender. It is also mandatory to explain what kind of opportunities, let's say in the fishing sector, or in the education sector, it should be the clause. And significant achievements have been garnered. There are gender desks in every ministry. Every higher education institution should have a gender desk. And eventually, the Ministry of Education is talking about should we also introduce gender desks at the primary schools and secondary schools. It hasn't been achieved, but at least it's being questioned. The other thing, though, is about policy issues. We talk about gender, and you won't find anywhere where the gender word isn't there. But we are still questioning ourselves. Has it made a difference to attitudes? Because sometimes it's mentioned as nominal, and that insensitivity to things that are done to women or girls are there, that impunity. So the gender rights agenda itself is still also going under questions on whether policies make a difference or implementation should make a difference. And I'll tell you when I come to education what it means there. And the other thing is also we've had a significant platforms of struggle. The civil society has helped a lot. There's a lot of activism by NGOs, and particularly in support of international NGOs, UNICEF, UN Women, you mentioned it, World Vision, the excellent platforms for struggle. But so many things still exist. For example, the NGOs supported the change of the Land Act and the land policy, and there's a special clause for women to own property. Even for mortgage, a woman should consent to mortgage property with the man, with the partner. But we have a lot of issues yet. Then the NGOs also facilitated the drawing of the Sexual Offences Special Provision Act, but we have significant amount of rape, FGM, female genital mutilation, early marriages. And then we had a campaign called We Can End Violence Against Women, and it facilitated having change agents who are men themselves. Men actually go to communities and sensitize on against violence against women. I hope it is also in Italy. I don't know. And also some capacity building for women into political leadership. Oof, sorry.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't. Wow. Sorry. Oh, yeah.
Too fast.
Too fast.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the education platform eventually. There are so many things, so many advances that have been done in education, I wanted to say. But one thing that I wanted to mention in particular, and that has raised a lot of issues in Tanzania and the world, is the clause from the National Education and Training Policy of 2014. This was a policy that was passed during our fourth phase of presidency under Kikwete, who know him. And for the first time, it had established fee-free education for, we call that basic education. That means the 11 years of first education should be fee-free. Because being not a very well-resourced in terms of household income, there was an issue on who can attend education. And there were so many dropouts or so many misenrollments, people not being enrolled, children. But whom did it impact more? It impacted more on the girls, particularly when it comes to making a decision on who should go to secondary school, who should you support for boarding school, because boarding school is not very, very cheap, and it made a very big difference. But this policy made a difference, and one thing that it has made very, very positive is that it has improved gender parity in primary and secondary school level. And we find a lot more girls coming in than it had been before, but also a lot more girls from poor families. We have these children called from internal migrant families, where they come into a community, do not have much, they are not quite well resourced, but cannot even go to school. But now it is mandatory to enroll them, so you find them enrolled. Then we have a clause called a capitation grant. The capitation grant is, I think it's come from a World Bank loan, but one of its provision is that there should be a certain amount of money that supports girls during their menstruation. And every school should buy sanitary pads. Of course, the amount is so small. And with the enrollment, sorry. The amount is so small, thank you. And the sanitary pads are not enough, but at least there has been some consideration that some girls cannot attend school in certain days of the month because of not having sanitary pads. So this clause was taken very, very positively. It doesn't suffice, but at least it was an idea. The dropout cases have reduced, but they're still there, but for different causes. For the girls, it's more about pregnancy, But for the boys, it's more about truancy. And in some schools, the dropout rates of boys is even more than for the girls. But at least the education sector is trying to see, how do we address these girls? Yeah. In higher education now, for that matter, higher education, as I said before, has been gender sensitive for a very long time. In 1976, our first president actually said that there is an issue for girls not going to higher education because they are forced to get married. So he made a decree that girls after Form 6 should go straight to higher education, while boys did 2-year services. And it made a difference. It made a difference, but it didn't suffice. In 1990s, the higher education sector had something called preferential access. Here, the government made a decision that they have to make a provision that allows girls to go into higher education, even if they have lower points than boys. And what was done was to give them a special favoritism of 2 cut-off points, because it was argued that sometimes girls do not have very good grades in high school, not because they are not intelligent, but because of circumstances. They are probably made to work more at home than the boys, don't have much time to study. They are probably in certain conditions that they can't perform better. So that was the program, and it made a lot of difference. Then there was pre-entry programs, particularly for the STEM students, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And then we have mainstreaming gender. I'm part of a mainstreaming gender process in the University of Dar es Salaam, and we've been doing this since the 1990s. But at the moment, we are doing our second gender policy, where teaching gender in the academia is taken to be mandatory. Of course, it has worked a little bit, but the science subjects haven't taken it up. Although they have small programs on supporting women into their specializations. Recruitment is also not very gender sensitive. There is a gender clause on recruiting female academics, but where do you get them when they're not even at the university? But there is a process of saying, how do you mentor young, good girls and make them join the academia so that they will teach higher education? Those skills are not there, so you find a very, very big difference in terms of leadership in higher education. Forgive me a little bit.
Perhaps with the mouse.
With the mouse?
Okay.
Oh, good.
That's good.
Yeah. Yeah. Now education has a big influence on employment and labor force participation. As I said before, the government in Tanzania's policies are no discrimination in recruitment, but also in promotion. There's also a much emphasis on income generation, the small funds for women. This is a clause in every local government authority. Because one thing that has been argued is that let women work, give them the capacity to work, and then you can build their capacity. But the loans are quite meager. There's the national economic policy, there are small funds for women to make them work, but they're also very small. Now, as you can say, I wanted to say that why I'm emphasizing on education. Education in Tanzania is seen to be one of the platforms where women can make it. But at the moment, even if you see the data on employment, see where they are. There's a huge difference in the sectors. But there are a lot of women in the agricultural sector, because we are predominantly still an agricultural community, and also in household economic activities, but not in government. You don't see them in parastatal organizations, neither in other sectors. So there's a huge difference. And it is already known that the higher education that woman gets, the more profitable employment that one gets. The informal sector is seen as one of women's refuge. The good thing about the informal sector of Tanzania is that it lets women, even if it's a very small kind of work, we have a huge number of market women. They're very proud because they own the income, they own the process, and can actually dictate terms even at the home. The informal sector has allowed many women to support their children to school, but it's very vulnerable. We are a community that is changing. Industries is coming in, small industries, and the types of jobs that they get now, they come easy, go easy. Very small employment, no insurance, job security very small. So those are the things that we are working with. And then the health sector, I just wanted to mention the reproductive health care. One thing that Tanzania is doing is in addressing strategic and practical needs of the women, training service providers. And now there's a huge emphasis on making at least basic services accessible to people. But being a huge country, it is still a challenge. And resource shortage is making it very, very different. But one thing that I want, and this picture, this picture shows, for whoever knows Swahili, the health sector is now emphasizing on engaging men. So the fight for gender is trying to see how do we engage men in the reproductive health care, because Tanzania had a huge problem of maternal mortality, infant mortality, and HIV was causing a lot of violence, intimate partner violence, particularly sometimes when men would actually claim that it was the woman abroad, that kind of thing. So poor education, poor information, but with cultures, has made the government redesign why it is very important to have men joining women in the whole reproductive health care. We have a huge issue on gender-based violence, but it's also because of maintaining to traditions and not poor sensitization, but rigidity to change. Patriarchy still is there. Impunities are still there, though we have a very good policy, but also inequality in resource ownership. Sometimes poverty, I wanted to say poverty challenges dignity. A woman won't leave an abusive house. She doesn't have good education. She doesn't have alternative incomes. Where would she go? So she clings to religion or clings to culture. It's very different. But there are so many issues with gender-based violence which are being addressed. So what can be done? One of the things that we've been doing and the country has been doing is activation the women themselves. This is a Maasai woman whom traditionally wouldn't speak in public, but through education, sensitization, they are being made to speak and to make demands. So those things haven't changed, but at least women are trying to make, this is in a meeting that we were trying to see how do they talk about their own identity and what does it mean to be a Maasai woman in a community which is traditionally very, very patriarchal, yeah. So we are repositioning the cultural position, thinking about the person themselves, but we're beginning with the individual themselves. This is what it's been doing. So making them be active to pursue also opportunities, but also through access of information. And as you can see, information, how do you inform them in their own culture, their own languages, but making them engage. But the other thing is also, which hasn't been very successful, but is confronting masculinities. Our huge problem is about this rigidity in changing mindsets. And that masculine kind of identity, why such impunity? So even, let's say, when you have a cause on gender-based violence and it goes to the police and to the courts, you find this kind of dilly-dallying, simply because a man would rally with the other policemen and delay the process. And why should policy level be insensitive? This is a lot of challenge, but still, it's being done. And civil society is supporting it very, very strongly. So the other thing is education. Education, as I said, gender equality should start at the home. This hasn't started very well, but things are being made to, people are being made to understand. How do you make a man at a university level, for example, really stop talking about gender being synonymous to women only? You start it at the home. And then other opportunities also, yeah. And, but the other question that I think some of you would share is about what do you teach about gender at what level? As I said, we probably don't have much problem when it comes to enrollment at primary level, but we have issues to do with what is it about gender that you teach a young girl? We are faced with gender-based abuses at very, very lower level. How do you teach a girl to protect? And there's this whole thing about cultures and traditions that is becoming very, very controversial at the moment. And the curriculum now is trying to accept that instead of just teaching children about the biological processes, let's say menstruation only, and the danger days, you also need to teach them to be vigilant and protect them. And some of the teachers, even at the ministry, the officials at the ministry are trying to say, don't touch on cultures. But activists are trying to say, but these girls know these things are happening. So what are you trying to tell them? What is gender here? What is culturally appropriate to teach a young girl and a young boy about gender? That is what is happening. Mm-hmm. So finally, I wanted to say some of the persistent questions that are remaining is about teaching about gender. Teaching about gender as a norm, simply as part and parcel of the curriculum, or teaching people to be very creative, critical interrogation of knowledge, that process of generating knowledge. What is gender? How does it apply within that cultures? And the other thing is about academics. All universities, all higher education institutions now have a very strong mainstreaming of gender in most research, particularly in the social sciences. But one thing, if you make an analysis, sometimes it's about adding on gender in some of the researches. It's not about a critical analysis of thinking, what is it about gender that matters in this particular process? For example, the methodologies that we use, you may simply add women participants, let's say, or women respondents in a particular research. But when it comes to analyzing the gendered context that probably creates, let's say, inequality in access to legal assistance, it's not very well done. And that's why there's so many loopholes still continuing. The other thing is on the institutional limitations. Institutional limitations, this is a huge thing. And as I said before, all policies have the question on gender, on women. But sometimes when it comes to make a decision, let's say changing the Marriage Act, if I may say, the Marriage Act in Tanzania allows for marriage of a girl at 14 years, as long as the parents consent, and a boy at 15, and it has been challenged. But the government didn't consent to its changing. And we had very vigilant young two lawyers who went to the High Court and actually won a petition, but the government and parliament refused to change the Marriage Act. So speaking truth to power, that kind of thing, it's very still. And there's a lot of references, we shouldn't touch culture because it would make the status quo delicate, but it doesn't make a difference. So those are the things, yeah. And then the other thing is also going down the ladder. One of the things that people are fighting for is let's address gender-based violence against children. We had, I think the Legal and Human Rights Center in Tanzania established that sexual violence against children was one of the huge violated human rights last year. Although we have programs called Tuseme, Let's Speak Out, child marriage are still prevalent. There's this double standards. So those are the things that are happening, are still remaining. What do you do about them? So more politics, child pregnancy. Child pregnancy, I just wanted to mention it because it also has raised a huge furor in the international platforms because of our first president, who actually declared that he won't allow schoolgirls who get pregnant to be brought back to school. Although the policy that I mentioned earlier, the 2014, had actually approved. He said he doesn't want young mothers coming in and going out to feed the baby. He said it was a very strong statement that nobody liked it very much, but who should say? So, but fortunately now, last year he was pressured by the World Bank because the education sector receives a huge loan from the World Bank, pressured by civil society and the World Bank, and eventually they've consented to not to retain the girls in school, but they say they will take them to an alternative schooling system that probably use the same curricula as the other form of schooling. But why? Why should we have these things happening here? Yeah. And poverty, yeah, poverty is still a factor. It actually affects access to resources. It affects access to proper boarding facilities for girls, for example. And in the process, they are vulnerable to so many other things. And in conclusion, I want to say that we are changing policies. Policies now, we are trying to say Tanzania should stop emphasizing on simply equality. Fairness is very important because fairness sorts of acknowledges that it's not about the numbers, it's about the cultural and historical conditions that a certain population group faces versus the other. And that's why we have these gender rights and women's rights. And then also advancing the multi-stakeholder platforms, communities, academia, the NGO and government, but also innovative learning and sharing experiences and bringing in more men into the fight for gender rights and equality. So, having said that, thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.